Well, hello, and here I am back to make another video. Today I want to talk about the Judeo-Christian view of the environment, I guess you could say, nature, but more specifically, what humanity's proper relationship to nature is. Okay, to do this, I'm walking through an absolute disgrace of a garden that I attempted this year. I moved it to a new place and it's just not going well. So I'll start with humility here, saying that whatever my role is in relationship to stewarding the earth, I'm not doing so hot right now. If there's anything I'm doing really well at, it's growing weeds. I'm doing really great at that right now. Okay, so let's talk about this question. Here's the big question. The big question is, well, I guess there's two big questions here. Let's talk about the primary one first, and then talk about one question that it depends on. So the primary question that I'm really interested in is, what is the proper relationship? What's the normative relationship, or what relationship should humans have to nature? Okay, that's the question. And what I want to do is point out a spectrum. There's two poles on this spectrum, two extremes. And what I'll argue is that the Judeo-Christian view is actually a midpoint between these two poles. It's the mean between the extremes. Okay, so that's the question. How should what is humanity's job with nature? Or do they have any proper role, or can they just do whatever they want? And this question is going to depend on another question. That is, what in the world is of intrinsic value? Okay, so we'll have to define what that means. What is of intrinsic value? Is it just humans? Is it just nature? Is it both nature and humans? Okay, obviously other things beside those two things could be of intrinsic value, but those are the two things that are important for us today. Okay, so let's talk about what intrinsic value is. Let's start with one really basic ethical distinction. That is between intrinsic and instrumental value. Okay, this is core to basically all of ethics. You can't really get away from this distinction. It will be applied here in what we could call environmental ethics. The distinction is this. Something is of intrinsic value if it's valuable all on its own. That is, it would be one test for this some people use, it's not a perfect test, is would it be valuable if it was the only thing that existed? Okay, it's not a perfect test, and there's a few reasons for that we don't need to get into. But in a world with just this, would there be value in that world, or would there not? If the answer is yes, it's probably of intrinsic value. If no, it's probably not. So again, intrinsic value intuitively is just the stuff that's valuable all on its own, not because it gets you something else that's valuable. On the other hand, instrumental value works like this. Something is of instrumental value if it's good for getting you something else of value. Okay, so that's instrumental value. I'll give you some examples of each, some kind of uncontroversial examples, I hope. Money is the perfect example of an instrumental value, and of a purely instrumental value. Because as we'll see, some things can be both intrinsically and instrumentally valuable. In fact, that's the way most of the things that are valuable in the world work, or at least most of the intrinsically valuable things. Okay, but money seems to be just purely instrumentally valuable. That is, if you just have money and that's it, and you can't do anything with it, it has no value. In fact, the only value it has is the value you can use to get you other things of value, separate and wholly distinct from money. So you use money to get you things like food to eat. Now, that doesn't mean food itself is intrinsically valuable. You could make an argument that it is in some cases, but it's at least also instrumentally valuable. The point is, you don't have value with money until or unless it can get you something else of value. It's instrumentally valuable. Okay, instrumentally valuable. until it can get you, it's instrumentally valuable. Okay. Intrinsic value. Lots of people want to make the case, and you'll hear rhetoric around this. All right, let's talk about intrinsic value. Let's try to come up with an example of that. Well, a lot of people want to say that various forms of art are intrinsically valuable. And here's their case. This actually used to be a motto of certain movements in aesthetics and art. Art for art's sake. That is, you're not doing art for any reason outside of art. It's just for the value that the art has on its own. It's intrinsically valuable. Now, this is a little bit murkier of a case than money is for instrumental value, because art can also be instrumentally valuable. It's not purely intrinsically valuable, okay? So, yes, it's intrinsically valuable. It's good on its own. It's good that it exists, even if it doesn't do anything for anybody outside of the value of art. But it can also do things for people, right? So you could have maybe therapeutic benefits of art. There's music therapy, for example. And maybe you could imagine getting value out of art, even if you don't care about the art itself. Like you could be some sort of anti-art Philistine, which I kind of am, and you could still get benefits. You could be convinced that, look, here's some studies that show that that art gives you these mental health benefits, and you could use art for purely instrumental purposes, and it could be instrumentally valuable in that way, even if you don't recognize its intrinsic value. But it's not like these are mutually exclusive. It could be both and at the same time. You could say, I love the art for its own sake, and I also like that it gives me mental health benefits. Or I love the art for its own sake, I also love that it helps me launder money, because there's no objective value, financially speaking, to the art, and so it's a great money laundering tool, which I think is true. All right, so that's intrinsic versus instrumental value. Let's talk about how this relates to our debate. In environmental ethics, broadly speaking, there is this question of what is intrinsically valuable. On one pole of the spectrum, you have the view that only humans are intrinsically valuable. And thus, nature, if it has any value at all, is only instrumentally valuable. It's only good because of what it can do for humans. That's one view. That's a view some have argued, and I'll link to a paper, or I'll screenshot a paper here that's really famous for making this argument. Some have actually argued that this view is an inheritance of the Judeo-Christian tradition. They think that when, for example, in the book of Genesis, God tells humans that, hey, nature is yours to use and to dominate or to subdue, that this sort of view is in the background, or at least, or maybe even explicitly being pushed. That is that, hey, listen, the earth is for humans, and it's only good for humans. I mean, the only good it has is for humans. I don't think that's right. I'll argue that in a few minutes here. But I think it's less controversial that this gained a lot of steam, at the very least, with the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment project. For example, the work of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was big here. One of his most famous quotes is, knowledge is power. So he had this view that the benefit of scientific knowledge was to instrumentalize nature for human ends. Now, not a Bacon scholar, at least not in that sense. So I don't know exactly whether he was fully explicitly committed to this, but at least that view was taken by many as justification for exploiting the earth for human purposes, and kind of underlying that, sort of to do that requires the view, at least on a practical level, that the earth is only good because of what it can do for humans. In which case, this earth would not be good for much, at least the way I've been using it. Just sort of like a little redneck emporium of old little Caesar's boxes that I'm trying to use to stop the weed growth to no avail, and then some purple hull peas and okra that are not producing. So if nature was only of instrumental value, this plot of land would have very little value currently. Okay, on the other end of the spectrum, you have what would commonly be associated with leftist approaches to environmental ethics, and that would be the view that it's actually the opposite. It's not just that nature does have intrinsic value, but in the most extreme views, humans don't have intrinsic value, and in fact, it's only nature that has that value. So look, you can see the exact reverse in these two views. One is that humans have intrinsic value, nature doesn't. The other is that nature has intrinsic value, humans don't. Now, most environmental activists that I don't think would accept that second, the extreme view there, that humans don't have intrinsic value, but they would certainly think that nature has intrinsic value on its own. And you can see this in movements to protect endangered species or non-endangered species, to protect certain ecosystems. Now, you can actually see two different kinds of arguments that are often made for those sorts of movements. And it's really important to see how these arguments differ, because you can see the two different perspectives in these arguments. On one, the more popular argument, and a lot of the environmental activists in the 70s and the environmental philosophers in the 70s, the more extreme ones thought that this was a compromise position, that was objectionably a compromise position. On the first kind of argument, the environment, the reason we need to protect these ecosystems or protect this endangered species or keep this company from strip mining in this location is because of the effects it will have on humans. And they'll say, look, again, you could break this down into two subtypes of argument. They might say, one, I can show you exactly how the elimination of this species or of this ecosystem will negatively affect humans. If we eliminate this wetland, it's going to eliminate a natural buffer zone that actually filters the water that feeds into this lake that people drink from. And so if you build on this wetland and you fill it in, you eliminate that natural filter, people's water gets worse. On the other hand, they might say, hey, we don't know exactly what effect it's going to have on humans, but we know that the way ecosystems or species existence works in general is that you can have effects that we don't see, and so we shouldn't allow this thing to be eliminated or exterminated or whatever, because even though we don't know the effects, it will probably or almost surely have some, and therefore we shouldn't eliminate it. So that's the one kind of argument, two subtypes. But the important common feature there is that the reason you shouldn't eliminate the ecosystem or the species or whatever is that it will have effects on humans. And a lot of people that endorse the second type of argument think that it's a compromise argument. And they say it doesn't matter if it has effects on humans. It has value on its own. So I don't have to show you, I don't have to give you any reason to think that this will ever have a negative effect on humans. And in fact, I guess in a crazier case, it could have a positive effect on humans if we eliminated this species or this ecosystem or whatever. And that's still not good reason to eliminate it, and we still shouldn't eliminate it because it has value on its own. You can see both of those kinds of arguments happening in any one of these major environmental debates about a particular ecosystem or natural entity, species, whatever. Okay, so behind that is the view, at the very least, the sort of moderate view there is that at least nature has intrinsic value. The more extreme version of that is not only does nature have intrinsic value, but humans actually don't. The more extreme, if you're not convinced that that exists, you can go and look up antinatalism. Now, antinatalism is not always an environmental thesis, but what it is it's the claim that people should stop having children, people should stop existing, essentially. And one of the arguments for that claim is that it's bad, humans are bad for the environment. Now, I think underlying that is the idea that there's not really intrinsic value to humans. Because if there were, you wouldn't have a clear-cut argument that people should stop existing just because they're bad for the environment. Because if there's value to the humans, then you have this complicated task of weighing the value of humans versus the disvalue that they provide to the environment. So lurking beneath the surface, I don't know if anyone says this explicitly, but lurking beneath the surface with anti-natalist arguments, at least the ones from environmental premises, is the idea that humans don't really have value. It's nature that's valuable. If we have to choose between humans and nature, if humans are going to keep existing, then they're just going to harm nature, then we should choose the nature, because that's what has value, intrinsic value. Okay, all right. Hard break here, because that's the big environmental ethics debate. That's pretty much the core debate in environmental ethics. There's lots of other ones, but that's the core thing going on, which is, what are the things that have intrinsic value? Does nature, in particular, have intrinsic value? All right, so separate question. This is the primary question that I started with. What is the role, the proper role of humans in relation to nature or the environment? Okay, so again, you can see multiple answers to this question. And it kind of tracks with the intrinsic instrumental debate, and we'll talk about that, but it's not as clean as it could be, or as other, coincidental arguments coinciding with each other sometimes are. Okay, so think about one extreme view. The proper role of humans in relation to the environment is, I guess you could call this no proper relationship. They can do what they want. And in fact, this would naturally go with the view that humans should just do things with the environment, with nature, that are good for them, good for the humans, that is. This one's pretty clear that would seem to rest on the idea that nature does not have intrinsic value. If you don't think that there's some role that humans should play with the environment beyond self-interest, then you've probably got the view, you kind of have to have the view, that nature doesn't have intrinsic value. If it has intrinsic value, then it demands things of you. This is how intrinsic value works. If a piece of art has intrinsic value, it's not that it has rights per se, but there are duties you have towards it, usually. You shouldn't just destroy it because you feel like it, okay? So the fact that you think there's no obligations you have that humans have toward nature, you really can't get there without saying there's no intrinsic value to it. People have rights because they have intrinsic value, plausibly. So we have obligations to it. If we have no obligations to something, no intrinsic value. Okay, on the other hand, you have people on the other end of the spectrum who think humans' proper relationship to nature is just stop messing with it, because humans are only bad for the environment. You see this view represented, again, usually on the liberal end of the spectrum, especially among activist types, that the best thing humans can do is not interact with the environment, because everything we touch fails, right? You come in, you try to build something, you destroy a species, you didn't even know it, right? Or maybe you even have good intentions. You come in and you build a dam, and maybe you do that for humans, but maybe you're also thinking we can foster some species growth here. Well, unknowingly you flooded the natural habitat of whatever animal species. And this, you see this time and again. There are lots of instances of this where there are known or unpredictable consequences of human interaction with the environment. So you talk, one example is in city planning, you can find talk of impervious surfaces or impermeable surfaces, and the negative effects they have on the environment. So this is things like sidewalks, streets, things like that, things that don't allow water to get into the ground. And they increase pollution in the water, because grass and rocks and stuff are natural filters for water when it goes wherever it goes when it rains. But if you have a bunch of sidewalks and streets and the water goes straight into the drains, it's just washing everything it had in it and everything it picks up straight into that waterway. Okay, look, so people are saying here, human building, human artifice, bad for the environment. And again, you can look at those particular cases, but you can kind of get a sense from certain types that the idea is that's just the way it is. And so if you want to benefit the environment, you have to limit human interaction with it. Take the existence of national and state parks, for example. The idea there being to preserve nature, we have to leave it alone. Or nature preserves, I guess, is an even better example. Okay, so we're finally going to get to what the point that I'm trying to make about the Judeo-Christian view, and the Judeo-Christian answer to the proper role of humanity in the environment. Okay, so here's what I would argue. I think the Judeo-Christian view is not either of those extremes. And it's not, and if we talk about the other debate, it's not the view that humans alone have intrinsic value, and it's certainly not the view that nature alone has intrinsic value. I think it's the view that they both have intrinsic value. So it's going to piss everybody off on both of those poles, I think, at least the extremes. And what that gives rise to is the view that the human role in the world, at least with regard to nature, is to steward it. That's one word that's used, but that's kind of like Judeo-Christian lingo. What does that mean? It means that our job is to order nature. So let me give you a few pieces of evidence for this. And first, let me talk about what that means to order it. To order it, think about the classic distinction or division of things and roles in essentially, not all, but lots of mythology. Joseph Campbell was one to first talk about this, but you can watch this across all sorts of ancient myths, especially in the ancient Near East, where Genesis came from. What you see is this distinction between order and chaos. And what's kind of crazy is that among lots of these traditions, there's actually symbology or symbolism that coheres across cultures for these things, partly because they were interacting. But often order has certain things that, certain symbols that are associated with it, like land and light and division. Chaos has things that are associated with it, like water and darkness and lack of division, which is interesting. Okay, so if you look at, for example, the Enuma Elish, which is, I believe, still the oldest known creation myth we have. Doesn't mean it's the oldest one. It's the oldest one we have, and so the oldest one and also the oldest one we know about. You can look at that. You can set it alongside Genesis 1 through 3. I guess mostly 1 and 2. And you can see really important parallels. One of those parallels is this order versus chaos thing, that creation was accomplished via division. In the case of the Enuma Elish, it's the division of the dead bodies of gods. That's how you get creation of the world and of humans. The bodies are dead because there was a war between the gods, or at least fighting, I guess. And they, took the dead ones, carved them up, made stuff. All right. That's how order was brought into the world. You look at Genesis, you see some stark contrast there. Order is brought in through, not through violence. I don't know what else to call it. Love, some would argue. But it's still brought in through division, right? Look at every one of the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1, and you get dividing of things. You get dividing of light from dark. You get dividing of land from sea. And again, that's another motif of chaos and order there. And what God is doing is he's bringing order to the world. Throughout those 6 days, he's bringing order by separating things out, by dividing things and categorizing things. Now, when he makes humans, he gives them the first command. The first command in the Judeo-Christian tradition that God gives to humanity in Genesis chapter 1, it's right there, and he says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Okay, so interestingly, his first command to people is, make more people. And then he says, fill the earth up, subdue it. What does that subdue mean? Well, there's an argument to be made here that he's telling them to continue the work that he has started, which is ordering the world. On one interpretation, now I'm getting this one's not as clear in the text, but there's one reading of Genesis on which God almost only partially orders the world. He creates a local center of order in the Garden of Eden. And the implication on this reading of Genesis is that God created this local center of order surrounded by disorder. Obviously, the world had been ordered, largely, that is light and dark and sea and land. But the garden still represented kind of heightened order compared to what was around it, which was still at least somewhat chaotic. And God's intention was for humans to continue that. And when he tells them, spread out, fill the earth, make more humans, what he's saying is, keep this work going. Spread out, continue the creation of the garden. And importantly, continue the work of ordering that is represented in the garden. That is, the garden is ordered in a way that wilderness is not. Even though, again, there's order there in that there are categories and the land is separate from the sea and the light from the dark and all of that. Still, the garden represents order in a way that the wilderness does not. That's another common motif, is that the wilderness is associated with chaos in these myths. And so what God is telling them on this reading of Genesis, which I don't think is crazy, is bring the same kind of order that I have started in the world. And the reason the world on this view never got there is because humans screwed up and didn't do that. All right, that's a big long story, but in that story, there's an answer to our big question. The question was, what is the proper relationship of humans to nature? It's not to use it just for your ends, and it's not to leave it alone. In fact, wilderness is disorder in the ancient Near East and in Genesis. It's not full order, and God's command is to order that. So on the one hand, he's not telling people, hey, this is all yours to just do with it whatever you want, rape and pillage the land. But on the other hand, he's not saying leave it alone because you'll screw it up and humans are bad for the land. On the Judeo-Christian narrative, humans are essential to the flourishing of nature. You can't have a flourishing world without humans in that world. Just like you couldn't have had the world without God creating the world and creating order in the world. Well, we're just images of God, and the images of God are supposed to do the things that God did. That's what makes them the image of God, is that our role is the same as God's role in this one respect. Obviously, we don't want to say that every role we have is every role God has, but that we are meant to continue ordering the world. That's the sense that that's at least one of the senses in which we are images of God. And we're supposed to continue ordering a chaotic world. And I want to press back against the sort of metaphorizing of this. In a lot of Christian circles, you could read this, and the idea is, oh yeah, well, this is really kind of a metaphor for spreading the gospel of Jesus. That's right. I'm not denying that. I think that's right. As a Christian, I think that's correct, but it's a part of the truth, and we shouldn't take out the literal truth of this, which is, and also we're actually supposed to spread actual physical order in nature. That doesn't mean strip mining, but it also doesn't mean leave it alone as much as you possibly can because you're only bad for it. The Judeo-Christian view is we are an essential, integral part of the ecosystem. It cannot work properly. It cannot flourish without humans freely and wisely stewarding or ordering that nature, that land, that property. Which brings us back full circle to how crappy of a person I am in this garden and how horribly I've ordered this garden. At some point, maybe, the channel continues to grow, I'll come back and I'll show you how much better I'm doing, how the property is flourishing and there's no weeds and things are actually growing. See me in a few years, because I think it's going to take that long. But for now, we can stop and say, hey, I tried. I think I'm in the process of improving the land. I think that the land will flourish more because I'm here. So now I'm trying to apply this practically, but really aspirationally, because here I am having kind of failed at this. But the goal is, the idea is aspirationally, I just did a soil test out here. I found that of the macronutrients, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, I have virtually none at 2 separate locations in the garden. That's part of, so I'm not victim blaming the land here, but it's definitely its fault. No, the idea here is that I over the next year or two, I'll be able to improve the land, make it more fruitful. My plan is to bring the chickens and the goats in here, and they'll perform 2 functions. They'll eat down a bunch of the grass and weeds, and they'll fertilize it by pooping all over it. Chicken fertilizer is one of the best fertilizers out there, and they'll return nutrients to the ground which, for whatever reason, are not here. I'll also mulch it. I'll also, maybe provide other kinds of fertilizers, insoluble fertilizers. Okay, I'm not trying to give you a lesson in how to make a bad garden, but the point I'm trying to prove is that the level of application of all of the really high-level theoretical stuff I've just done, which is that ideally, aspirationally, and I know it can be done because it has been done, my work in the garden here will improve the land in such a way that if I hadn't been here, the land would not have been better. My role as a person, as a human, interacting with the land, is one on which the land could not fully flourish without me. Now, of course, you could argue back here. You could say, well, your concept of flourishing depends on your need of fruits and vegetables from this garden. And these are fruits and vegetables which the land wouldn't have value in producing if it weren't for the value they provided to me. Which brings us back to the point about the murkiness of the value distinction we created. I'm not saying that I'm only creating intrinsic value in this land. Of course, on the Judeo-Christian view, my family and I are also of some value, and some intrinsic value. And so it's not to say that just because I'm getting instrumental value out of it, I'm getting tomatoes, I'm getting purple whole peas, I'm getting onions, I'm getting green beans, cucumbers out of it, that doesn't mean that it lacks intrinsic value too. And so part of the view that I'm espousing here is that, just like art can have intrinsic and instrumental value, so the garden, just because it has instrumental value for me, doesn't mean I'm not adding intrinsic value to it. And part of that is bringing order to it, which is valuable on its own, separate from what it can do for me. So that, I think in that way, the Judeo-Christian view stands between these 2 poles. Humans are not just the only thing that's good in the world, and we can just pillage the earth for whatever we want. And also, nature is not the only thing that's of intrinsic value, such that humans should just leave it alone, or in the crazy case of antinatalism, go out of existence so that it can really do its own thing and flourish. Rather, both nature and humans are of intrinsic value, although arguably there's an ordering, a kind of hierarchical order within that nature in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Humans are probably of some greater kind of value, maybe. But still, nature has intrinsic value, and part of the role of humanity is to bring order to that nature in such a way that without humanity, the earth, the environment, nature in general, could not fully flourish.